right up front. James Shreve, a science writer, writes in the New York Times that Mr. Behe may be right that given our current state of knowledge, good old Darwinian evolution cannot explain the origin of blood clotting or cellular transport. A man named James Shapiro, who's a professor of microbiology at the University of Chicago, wrote, "There are no detailed Darwinian accounts for the evolution of any fundamental biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations." Jerry Coyne, who's a professor of evolutionary biology at Nature, wrote, "There is no doubt that the pathways described by Behe are dauntingly complex, and their evolution will be hard to unravel. We may forever be unable to envisage the first proto-pathways." Andrew Pomenkowski, a British scientist, writes in New Scientist, "Pick up any biochemistry textbook and you will find perhaps 2 or 3 references to evolution. Turn to one of these and you will be lucky to find anything other than, quote, evolution selects the fittest molecules for their biological function, close quote." So the point is that many reviewers of my book have agreed that these complex molecular machines so far are unexplained within a Darwinian framework. But some scientists claim that such explanations are out there somewhere. And a man named David Griffin, who's a professor of the philosophy of religion at Claremont College in California, nonetheless wanted to track down those explanations. And in his book, Religion and Scientific Naturalism, he said that the response I have received from repeating Behe's claim about the evolutionary literature, which simply brings out the point being made implicitly by many others, such as Crick, Denton, and so on, is that I obviously have not read the right books. There are, I am assured, evolutionists who have described how the transitions in question could have occurred. And he continues, "When I ask in which books I can find these discussions, however, I either get no answer or else some titles that, upon examination, do not, in fact, contain the promised accounts. That such accounts exist seems to be something that is widely known, but I have yet to encounter anyone who knows where they exist." And I think the most succinct summary of many reviewers of my book is contained in a book called The Way of the Cell, written by a man named Franklin Harold, who's an emeritus professor of biochemistry at Colorado State University, which was published by Oxford University Press a couple years ago. And Franklin Harold wrote the following. He said, "We should reject, as a matter of principle, the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity." And he cites my book. "But we must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations." Wishful speculations is oftentimes a kind of a word which actually means something called just so stories, which is a phrase oftentimes heard in biology, like the children's stories written by Rudyard Kipling a century ago, you know, how the tiger got its stripes, how the rhinoceros got its horn, how the bacterium got its flagellum. And it's kind of funny if you think about it, but if you think about it further, it's astonishing that a theory which has the allegiance of a fair number of biologists has been so utterly fruitless at explaining the molecular foundation of life. And it leads people like myself to believe that perhaps a different theory might be called for. Well, I want to say that this isn't the only problem for Darwinian theory. It goes much deeper. Here's the drawing of the bacterial flagellum, which occurs in a biochemistry textbook by Voet and Voet. But this is just a little cartoon of the flagellum. And it leaves out many, many problems that would have to be overcome for something like this to be produced. For example, how is such a thing put together? How do the parts interact with each other? An outboard motor in our everyday life is assembled by an intelligent agent. But materials in the cell have to assemble themselves. How do they do that? Well, the components of the bacterial flagellum in reality aren't these nice little spheres and oval shapes and discs and so on. Rather, they're composed of proteins which have very complex shapes such as this. And proteins bind to each other specifically by having surfaces which are both geometrically complementary as well as chemically complementary. This shows 2 macromolecules binding to each other. And you can see the physical shape complementarity. but also on the surface. Here's a little cartoon taken from Vogt and Vogt's book. This shows that these chemical properties of the surface also have to be complementary to each other. Where there's a positive charge on one, there has to be a negative charge on the other. Where there's an oily spot from a hydrophobic amino acid side chain, there has to be a hydrophobic spot on the other one, and so on. Where there's a hydrogen bonding donor, there has to be a hydrogen bonding acceptor, and so on. Well, the question that I have become interested in is how do things such as this develop? You'll notice that in the interaction of these two proteins, and there are 30 to 40 different proteins which participate in making the flagellum, in each pair there are multiple interactions which hold the things apart. How do those things develop? Recently, about 6 months ago, myself and David Snoke at the University of Pittsburgh published a paper which tries to address this question, which asks how easy would it be to develop a specific interaction between two proteins that did not have this interaction before, as evolution would be expected to have to do. And our paper presents a mathematical model which can be simplified in the following way. If up at the top you see that little array of boxes, we can represent that as the amino acid sequence of a protein. And when a little plus comes along, that means that it has accumulated a mutation which potentially could interact with another protein if it had another few mutations which comprised a set which allowed the interaction to be stable. The red X shows a deleterious mutation which has accumulated in the protein. And the problem would be to accumulate sufficient beneficial mutations before you accumulate even one deleterious mutation. And again, you can model this mathematically. This looks a little more complex than it really is. All you have to do is consider the number of organisms in the population and the number of sites that would have to change, the point mutation rate, and other such factors. And what we did was calculate what we expected the number of generations to be to have just a protein binding site appear between two proteins if you needed multiple amino acid changes before such an interaction would occur. And what we calculated was that even for getting just two proteins to interact, it would take a very, very large number of generations. On the order of 10 to the 20th. I didn't explain the axes here, but the top axis is the population size. The bottom axis is the number of loci that would have to change, and the y-axis is the number of generations that would take to fix this mutation in the population. It should be said that most proteins in the cell exist as complexes not of two or by themselves, but complexes of 6 or more. And so the question is, could those be assembled by a Darwinian process? And I have reason to be skeptical that that's the case. Other evidence that shows that microevolution does not necessarily lead to macroevolution has come about recently in a paper by a man named Barry Hall at the University of Rochester. And I think this shows the benefit of not assuming that microevolution does lead to macroevolution. He was worried about the development of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Antibiotic resistance is often put forward as an example of Darwinian evolution, and many times it is. But when scientists search for antibiotics, they're searching for the limits of Darwinian evolution. They're searching for antibiotics which will be beyond the capacity of bacteria to evolve resistance to. And that's what Barry Hall was trying to do. I won't read his abstract, just a couple of key sentences. He says, with what I think is a very commendable attitude, instead of assuming that this particular protein will evolve rapidly and therefore confer immunity to antibiotics on a particular bacterium, it would be highly desirable to accurately predict the evolution, its evolution in response to a certain antibiotic selection. And when he did that by in vitro mutation in the laboratory, he concluded that in vitro evolution was used to predict whether the protein has the potential to involve an increased ability to confer resistance to this antibiotic. And he says, the results predict with greater than 99.9% confidence that even under intense selection, the protein will not evolve to confer increased resistance to the antibiotic. So he's saying that he has found the limits, at least of this protein, to Darwinian evolution, at least in the foreseeable future. So the point is that not all things can occur by tiny, tiny changes and selectable intermediates leading to more complex changes. And that's been what I have thought in my consideration of these things. So I think I agree with this statement in the Minority Report that I don't think I am an example of a person who disagrees that microevolution, at least in biochemistry, where I'm an expert, can be extrapolated to explain completely new systems. And I'd be glad to respond to any questions, John. Mr. Calvert.
Dr. Behe, thank you so much for your presentation. I guess I would have one question. In the first paper that you did with Dr. Snoke, what was the bottom line conclusion of that? Could you sort of simplify that?
The bottom line was that a process called gene duplication, where a gene coding for a particular protein is duplicated and is free to accumulate mutations, is unlikely to lead to new protein features which require more than a couple amino acid changes to produce them. Once you go beyond just one change to lead to the new feature, and you need 2 or 3 or 4, which is the case if you need to develop a new specific interaction between two proteins, then the expected amount of time that would take in reasonable population times starts to become prohibitive over 100 million generations and higher.
And how many members in the population in that 100 million generations?
Well, again, it depends on the number of loci, but if you consider about 6, which is roughly the number of amino acids involved in a specific interaction between two proteins, it would take on the order of 10 to the 21st or so, which is would be prohibitive for virtually any organism except a single-celled organism.
Well, 10 to the 21st?
Yes. That's a big number.
And that's just, and you're saying for the proteins to interact, and that's for a binding site?
That's right. That's not considering the function of the proteins. It's just as if you had, for example, that spring in the mousetrap, and you wanted it to attach to, say, the catch, and you didn't want an intelligent agent to put it together. How likely would it be if it mutated in a way similar to the way proteins do in the cell? In order to do that, you'd need a long time and a very large population size, prohibitively large, just to get those two things together, not even worrying about whether their shapes were the right shapes for the purpose, just to get them to stick specifically to each other. It's a problem which I think is very much underappreciated, not only by the general public, which doesn't know much about it, but also by the scientific community, which generally doesn't spend much time thinking about it.
Thank you very much for your coming to testify. I believe I don't have any further questions. Mr. Aganagirai, you're a witness.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Sir, I have a few questions for the record for you. What is your opinion as to the age of the Earth?
I think it's what physicists, geologists say, about 4.6 billion years.
Do you accept the general principle of common descent that all of life is biologically related to the beginning of life?
My position is similar to Professor Nord's one or two ago, that depending on what you mean by common descent, I do believe in biological continuity of organisms, yes.
Do you accept that human beings are related by common descent to pre-hominid ancestors?
With that exception in mind, and depends on what you mean by common descent, yes, I do.
It is true, is it not, that nowhere in the Kansas Standard does it say that natural selection is the only mechanism for evolution?
I have not read through the entire Kansas Standards. I was concentrating specifically on that one paragraph that I showed on the first slide, so I couldn't tell you for sure.
You have not been provided with draft 2 of the majority opinion of the majority. You were not provided with draft 2 of the writing standards
of the minority report.
No. The majority report, draft 2. You were not provided.
No, I have not received them.
And to be fair to you, you said that at least as far as the minority report, you focused on a paragraph.
That's correct.
Do you regard Mr. Philip Johnson as a respected leader of the this intelligent design community?
Yes, I do.
Let me read a quote to you by Mr. Johnson, and I would like for you to tell me whether or not you agree with it. I can say this. You often find the greatest enemies of Christ in the church, even in high positions. There's a kind of person who may be sincere in a way, but is double-minded, who goes into church in order to save it from itself by bringing it into concert with evolutionary naturalism, for example. These are dangerous people. They're more dangerous than an outside atheist like Richard Dawkins, who at least flies his own flag. So I'm not impressed that somebody says that he's a Christian of a traditional sort and believes that evolution is our creator. This is, at the very least, a person whose mind is going in two directions. Such people often do a great deal of harm, of damage within the church. Do you agree with that statement?
I disagree with it. I think I have met many people who believe in Darwinian evolution and who are quite religious and think that it was God's way to produce life. As a matter of fact, I myself used to think that before I became skeptical.
Another quote by Mr. Johnson. Liberal Christians, those that accept evolution, are worse than atheists because they hide their naturalism behind a veneer of religion. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
The same. I disagree with that statement.
Therefore, do you agree or disagree with Mr. Johnson's portrayal of Christians who fully accept evolution and reject intelligent design?
Not at all. I sympathize with them. I used to be one of them until I changed my mind based on the scientific evidence.
You would agree with me, would you not, sir, that throughout the history of humanity, we have from time to time been confronted with observations for which we did not have an explanation?
Sure.
And you would agree with me, would you not, sir, that it is important for the progress of humanity that whenever we find questions that we do not understand, that we do our best to understand those questions following the scientific process?
Sure.
And you would further agree with me, would you not, sir, that just because something appears to be extremely complex, that doesn't necessarily mean that we must attach to it a supernatural explanation?
That's correct.
And you would agree with me, would you not, sir, that an appropriate place for the discussion of the supernatural may be theology classes, philosophy, etc.?
That's correct.
You would agree with me, would you not, sir, that history has taught us that we, at times, for example, in studying astronomy, looked at the complexities surrounding our universe and assumed erroneously that it was set up with the earth as the center of the universe, and that was the religious view which could not be challenged?
Well, no, I kind of disagree with that characterization. That was the scientific view at that age, because by observation, scientists saw that the stars and the sun went around the earth. That was actually the scientific observation. And it gets a little bit dicey on occasion when you introduce new ideas, because you may know, you probably do know, that Isaac Newton's theory of gravity was received with great suspicion during his time, because at that point it was considered to be a supernatural explanation, because it posited bodies interacting over space without physical interaction, and that kind of smacked of Aristotelian types of science.
And as a result, it is important to keep science and religion separated, correct?
No, no, it's a very complex business. By that example, I was trying to say that what some people think to be religion at the time may turn out to be understandable later on. But if you rule out an explanation which seems to describe the data pretty well, because it seems to have unwelcome philosophical or religious overtones, then I think that does science a disservice.
As I've sat through these hearings, there's this question that keeps coming back to me, sir, and perhaps you could help me. If a scientist wanted to do research to challenge the hypotheses of an intelligent designer, how could he or she go about it?
Well, it's actually pretty straightforward, surprisingly enough. Many people think intelligent design is unfalsifiable, but it turns out it isn't. And since my book has come out, many scientists have been attempting to falsify it. They pointed to a number of experiments in the literature which they say argue against it. One in particular was done by a man named Russell Doolittle, who's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and has worked on the blood clotting cascade for 40 years or so. And he advanced an argument against my idea of irreducible complexity with respect to the blood clotting system. And it turns out that his argument was incorrect, because he had simply misread the paper that he thought supported his ideas. But if he had read it correctly, he thought, and I would agree with him, that if things had developed the way he thought, it would have been a problem. Because the point is that intelligent design, as I see it, makes this claim. It says there is no unintelligent process which could produce the complexity that we see in the cell. So if a Darwinian biologist or somebody else who's skeptical of that went into their lab and showed that there was, in fact, some such process, which they already think there is, but if they demonstrated that, then my claim would be falsified.
I have nothing further of you, sir.
So you're suggesting that empirical science, and I have talked about it regularly as being observable, measurable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable, is something that is of great value in the science, in the research that you do.
Sure. Yes, I'm a biochemist. What I'm trying to do is explain the biochemistry that I see in the cell, or what has been discovered in the cell. And the only data I'm using to come to my conclusions is the physical structure of the biochemical systems that we've discovered, plus normal logic, such as an inductive reasoning, which is a common scientific way of thinking. Yes, so that's correct.
How would you describe the difference, or is there a difference? Let me start there first. Is there a difference between neo-Darwinian evolution and biological evolution? Are they used interchangeably?
Well, no, there is a distinction. Evolution is often, it has many definitions, as I'm sure you're aware. Oftentimes it means descent with modification. Darwinian, and now neo-Darwinian evolution, is a proposed answer to the $64,000 question of, if that happened, how did it happen? What caused this incredible, sophisticated machinery undergirding life? And Darwinian theory says it was by random mutation and natural selection. Other people, like Stuart Kauffman, says you're full of baloney, it's complexity theory. I think both of them are wrong. I think intelligence was involved. But Darwinian theory offers this specific answer to the question of how. Generic evolution, I think, is just common descent.
When I was saying biological evolution.
Yes, biological evolution
is just common descent. Is that what you're saying?
That's the way I understand it, yes.
Okay. That's what I'm asking. Regarding your comment about microevolution versus macroevolution, and can microevolution be extrapolated to explain macroevolutionary changes? And you said, and it also further says that that's a rather controversial topic. Is that something that is in the literature, that it is being fully explored?
Is what being fully explored, sir?
The idea between microevolution and macroevolution, microevolution leading to macroevolution?
Well, there are certainly biologists who are interested specifically in that. They're a subset of the people interested in evolution. But yes, there are papers in the literature which make the distinction, and some which wonder. And there was a recent article by a biologist named Sean Carroll at the University of Wisconsin a year or so ago, saying that it looks like it does because we don't have any evidence of any other process besides microevolution which could lead to it. But they did not consider other processes such as complexity theory or design. So it was kind of ruled out by default, or ruled in by default.
Thank you, Dr. Behe.
Thank you.
Mr. Calvert.
I think we're going to plug in my power cords. Dr. Abrams, members of the committee, my friend, Mr. Erganagirai, members of the public, I present my next witness, and guess who? It's yours truly. I had planned to have to speak to you about the legal issues today, and I plan to do that in a brief form. We had expected to call Mr. Joel Oster to give this opinion, but due to that not being possible, I have stepped into his shoes. The remarks that I will give today are general in nature. We plan to file a rather extensive legal brief along with our proposed suggested findings and fact and conclusions of law, and that will be handed to the committee following the hearings. Before I get to the legal issues, I would like to discuss a couple of a few exhibits that I believe would be helpful to the record. One exhibit was handed to the committee yesterday in connection with Mr. DeHart's testimony, and during the examination we didn't have an opportunity to get to that exhibit, and I will just discuss it briefly. The exhibit is a memorandum that documents an instance in which I helped a national public radio producer arrange a nationally broadcast debate between Mr. DeHart and Robert Dennison, a Texas biology teacher, and one of the individuals that filed peer reviews with respect to the Minority Report. And the essence of Mr. Dennison's comments were that the Minority Report was unacceptable because it would serve only to weaken the theory of evolution. And I thought that it was appropriate for Mr. DeHart to comment on this particular incident because what happened and what the memorandum reflects is that I arranged for a nationally broadcast debate between Mr. DeHart and Mr. Dennison on specifically the issue that we're dealing with today. The NPR published the menu for the program showing that Mr. DeHart would indeed debate Mr. Dennison, and that he would be interviewed by the producer prior to the debate. During that interview, Mr. DeHart and the NPR producer had an exchange about a number of the issues which we're discussing here. And the producer said, well, I'm sorry, I'm an atheist, and that perspective is not consistent with my view. And Mr. DeHart said, well, shouldn't your listeners be introduced to the two different perspectives? And she said, well, I have to think about that. And The next day in the morning, it was still publicized that Mr. DeHart would be on the program. Just a few hours prior to the broadcast, Mr. DeHart got a memo explaining that he would not be on the program because they had run out of time. Anyway, the memo documents a scenario indicating that there was more than sufficient time to have included Mr. DeHart's view in that, quote, debate. As it was, the Science Friday program presented only one side of the scientific controversy about evolution, and that's documented in that memorandum. The second document that I like to introduce into the record is an email dialogue that I recently had with a scientist that is explicitly using design theory to understand how the genome works. And I'm going to show, hopefully, the exchange here. If I can find it. There it is. In this dialogue, Albert Derues, a European scientist who works on trying to understand the genome, published a paper in which he used software engineering design concepts to understand how the genome works. I read the paper, and it struck me that what he was using in his work was not methodological naturalism, but rather it was methodological design. And so I sent him this email, and I said, Albert, it's my contention that bioscientists actually use design-type thinking in trying to understand the genome. That is not a metaphysical construct, rather as a methodological construct. Is that correct? And Mr. Derues replied, Dear John, most scientists indeed do use, quote, design as a practical approach or methodology. The teleological approach works very fine in deciphering systems like the brain, the eye. However, as soon as you touch on the subject of evolution, it is forbidden to talk about design. I have not come across real design thinking in trying to understand genome evolution. On the contrary, with the advent of neo-Darwinism, evolution has, in my opinion, become a magical thing that arose by chance without any goal direction. This basic lack of understanding evolution has led to the current posture evolutionary science has gotten into. No logical explanations about evolution before the Cambrian explosion, comprising 90% of evolution, and speculative theories about the last part. My article is the first from a methodological approach to show how design thinking can give new insight into evolution. The reason for introducing that into evidence is that for a couple of reasons. We've heard a lot of publicity about how the adoption of these standards, which would suggest to students that just exactly the kind of thinking that is portrayed in that slide, students would become to understand and appreciate. And that is the kind of thinking that is used to really understand biosystems. And here, 2 weeks before these proceedings, there is a huge hoopla about how the proposals in the Minority Report will drive bioscience out of the state. It seems, in my mind, rather absurd. The third document that I'd like to introduce is a collection of polls. The collection of polls is in a memorandum that we put together in March, and it collects polls from around the country in a number of different states, national polls, polls in Ohio, New Mexico, and so forth. I wanted in particular to show you the results of a poll that I think is highly credible. It was conducted by the Cleveland Plain Dealer in Ohio during the big controversy in Ohio over science standards in June of 2002. And I think that the poll had a number of different questions which were responded to, but the key question was the one I'm showing on the screen. It says, currently, the Ohio Board of Education is debating new academic standards for public school science classes, including what to teach students about the development of life on Earth. What position do you support? The first option was teaching only evolution. Only 8% opted for that particular paradigm, and I submit that the majority report essentially is a teaching only evolution position. It reflects methodological naturalism. The second response was teach only intelligent design, and that's 8%. And in my mind, that particular option is as bad as simply teaching only evolution. That's not what we want. We're looking for an objective approach that looks at both sides. And that seemed to be consistent with the next response, which was 59% for teaching both. And then teaching the evidence both for and against evolution, but not necessarily intelligent design, is 15%. Now, when you combine the 15% with the 59%, you get roughly 76%. There's another interesting option here, which is teach nothing about human development. That's 9%. And I'll comment later on about that particular option. In the case of Epperson v. Arkansas, in which a state adopted a statute which effectively excised the teaching of evolution. And in that statute essentially would mandate something like the second choice, teach only intelligent design. And in the court, in striking down that statute, and I think properly so, it struck down that statute because it was a biased formula. The court said that if the statute had eliminated all theories of origins and just taken the subject off the table completely, that would have been a religiously neutral posture, and it would have been permissible. And so the 9% position would be one way for the state of Kansas to achieve religious neutrality. However, the kids need to know about evolution. They need to be taught about origins because that, in fact, is a focus of much of a segment of science. And so science education needs to teach that subject. And so the question is, well, how do you teach it in a scientifically satisfactory way that is religiously neutral? And I submit that it is either teach both, or at least the fourth option, which is teach the evidence both for and against evolution, but not necessarily intelligent design, and that essentially reflects the Minority Report position. All the other polls in this document essentially reflect, these same percentages with a little bit more or less. Generally, the public very much wants an objective approach to teaching origin science. The third document, or the next document I would want to introduce, is an analysis of public comment of the 4 public hearings that were held about the minority report and the majority report. I attended all of those hearings, and I was interested in what an analysis would show of, as a general proposition, the comments of those opposing the minority report and a general summary of the comments of those that were for the minority report. And I'd like to mention Ken Carlson and Mark Matthews, who labored at length. Whoops. There you go. Okay. Mr. Carlson and Mr. Matthews spent an enormous amount of time analyzing the public testimony, and these were their conclusions. And I believe that we do have hard copy of their analysis, but we've had difficulty getting it printed out, but we will add it to the record at a later time, and of course these slides will be produced. Those opposing the minority report opposed it generally on the reason that they did not want intelligent design, creation science, or religion in the science classroom. That represented 61% of the negative comments. Others were opposed to the minority report because they wanted evolution only. They said evolution is accepted science, evolution is a fact, and that reflects 8%. That's an interesting number. It reminds me of the results in the Ohio poll. And others argued that intelligent design has not proven itself. ID is bad science, 6%. I would probably lump that up into 67%. And then there were those favoring the minority report, critical analysis of it. Well, let me comment further on this particular slide. I think that this is really significant evidence favoring the minority report. And the reason is that none of these arguments are consistent with that report. As we have repeated over and over again, and it's clear, the minority report does not contemplate or urge the state to put intelligent design, creation science, or religion into the science classroom. It's simply, or into the science standards. It actually seeks to take a religious problem out of the standards that adheres in the standards now, as has been testified to by numerous witnesses today. And so I think that those who, and the other thing it indicates, which is really sort of interesting, is that none of those witnesses, we must assume, read the minority report. Now, our witnesses have been criticized all day long for not reading the majority report, but it is very obvious that these witnesses had not read it because all of their arguments against it were not consistent with its content. Those favoring the minority report, 57%, again, is really consistent with the Ohio poll. Teach both sides. And others, 10%, evolution is not proven. It is not a fact. Evolution is religion, naturalism, philosophy, 8%. I don't believe evolution is a religion. And I don't believe as a theoretical concept it is a philosophy or an ideology. The problem, as testified by Dr. Manoj and Dr. Nord, is that when you combine a theory with a philosophy that does not allow the theory to be criticized, it elevates the theory to a dogma or an ideology that happens to support non-theistic religions. Teach intelligent design or creation science. Only 7% of those wanted intelligent design or creation science taught, which is, again, consistent with the minority report. We're not asking for it to be taught. Only permitted, not outlawed. If you outlaw it, then you're promoting an ideology. The conclusions of this analysis is that a vast majority opposing the minority report believe that intelligent design, creation science, religion are promoted by the minority report, and the testimony has shown this is not the case. Vast majority of those favoring the minority report want critical analysis of evolution, teach both sides, examine all evidence, very rational and legitimate concerns. My last exhibit that I want to introduce, which I believe we do have documented, and then the document has been passed out. Is an analysis of biology textbooks regarding the definition of science. And the purpose of my analysis, when I got interested in this issue, in fact, it was what prompts me to be here today, is not necessarily a lack of evidence for evolution. It was my becoming aware that science had stacked the deck about origins with the use of methodological naturalism. And you've heard a number of witnesses testify about that stacking of the deck. Evolution is essentially propped up by a methodological or philosophical construct. And I recognized this in the mid-1980s, and what got me into this debate was when in 1999 somebody asked me to look at the standards, and I saw that the state of Kansas was being asked to embrace that crutch that held Darwin up. And it's the philosophic bias that bothers me more than anything else, because it takes information off the table. And most of my career as a lawyer has been focused on the securities industry and making sure that stocks are sold honestly. And whenever you hand anything to the SEC for their acceptance of your offering statement, they ask you not necessarily what you have put in it, but they ask you, what have you omitted? What have you left out of the document? What really creates a problem in information is when you selectively hold out information. And it was my impression that it was this rule, methodological naturalism, that essentially selectively holds out information that got me interested in this. And I recognized that it creates two issues. First, a scientific issue. How can we scientifically know, whether the evolutionary account is valid if relevant evidence relevant to that theory is not allowed to be considered? And then that also creates a constitutional issue because origins, as we have heard testify over and over again, and undeniably impacts religion. And so when you enter a religious sphere, it is the obligation of the state to be neutral. And I'm sorry that I don't think I agree with Mr. Aganagari's definition of neutrality. Neutrality does not mean that the state is to favor non-theistic religions over theistic religions. And I believe that his idea and concept of neutrality is not really neutral at all. And we'll get to that later on. But I was interested in this issue because I was wondering what the textbooks did. Were the textbooks disclosing this philosophical bias? Were they explaining the bias so that at least the students would know the purpose and effect of it? And the analysis we conducted shows that the definition usually covered in the introductory chapter of the biology textbooks we reviewed simply discussed the scientific method and did not discuss any methodological or naturalistic exception to that method. Some texts included statements that restrict science to natural phenomena, but that's okay. That's what the study of science is. However, when they couple that with many people believe that a supernatural force or deity created life, that's true, but that does not justify the exclusion of scientifically valid evidence that can be detected scientifically that happens to support the belief in a deity. And that's exactly what methodological naturalism does. If the textbook was honest and candid, it would explain exactly that this book excludes evidence that is indeed relevant to the origins controversy, and we're not showing it to you. A few texts have a direct statement that science seeks natural causes for natural phenomena, but I would doubt that a 8th grader or even a senior in high school would understand the significance of that. Again, the issue is, are we fully disclosing the assumptions we're using and talking about the evidentiary basis for them? Others are less direct or infer it by saying that scientists consider the whole universe a system in which basic rules apply to all events, small or large. Scientists assume that those rules can be discovered through scientific inquiry. Again, although in some areas of science that's true, but the effect of that assumption is not discussed. The other thing we were interested in was how the textbooks covered the origin of life. And indeed, all the textbooks we examined did cover the origin of life. But it's only restricted to a naturalistic explanation. Little, if any, critique of origin of life hypotheses are included in the text. Emphasis on stories or plausible arguments about the unobserved past. Little or no inference of the unobserved past based upon observations in the present. This is my understanding of the picture in the textbooks, is that evolution is really, in many respects, propped up by this philosophy of naturalism. That's what holds it up. Naturalism rules out the evidence of design, which actually is the core the counter argument to evolution's core claim of no design. So when that counter argument is ruled out in a historical science, the only competitor is disallowed. That essentially winds up being a violation of the scientific method. It is this infrastructure which is not disclosed, which is actually used, as we've heard testify today. Now what happens is that none of this is really effectively described in the textbook. And so the textbook is almost like a tablecloth has been put over this pedestal, and the only thing the students see is we use the scientific method. We develop all of our explanations using empirical science, and so the students are led to believe that this is really supported by empiricism rather than naturalism. What we propose is that instead of using naturalism or religion, we use the scientific method. The Minority Report does not require that this evidence be shown, but at least it requires students to understand criticisms of that. Now I'd like to talk briefly about the legal issues. How much time do I have left? Okay.